My dear brothers and sisters, love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. Today's topic, and that is the gastrointestinal tract. We had talked about some of the basics in S.03, the normal structure and function, and a little bit about what happens in deviations, which we call disease. Today we shall look more at the deviations and not all of them, but some of the common ones. The gastrointestinal tract is really important because, in a way, it mirrors the health of a person. And on the other hand, the general health of a person uh, is influenced remarkably by the health of the gut. So it's a two-way relationship, and therefore, the gastrointestinal tract is really an important sort of a topic of interest to all of us. And with that little introduction, let me turn to the PowerPoint. Because whatever we feel gets reflected in a way sometimes in how we feel in the gut. How we feel in the tummy gets reflects quite often how we are feeling. Also, very often, an intuitively perceived truth. Also, we describe as a gut feeling. Uh, that intuitive voice which gives us the truth comes from the soul or its dynamic aspect, the psychic being, but then in common sort of parlance, we've quite often call it our gut feeling, that the feeling coming from within. And in a way, it's coming from the heart or it's coming from the soul or the gut. Uh, it's coming from somewhere deep within. And in a way, the stomach is deeper than the heart. Uh, Now, here's a little quote from Mark Twain, as usual, is a subtle humor also there. To eat is human, to digest divine. This is a picture of the gastrointestinal tract. Uh, the food enters through the mouth, gets mixed with saliva, gets swallowed, goes down the food pipe or the esophagus, reaches the stomach, where it stays for a few hours. From there, it moves into the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum, and then after that, the jejunum, and then this ileum, about 20 feet of small intestine coiled up within a rather narrow space, and then finally, this opening into the large intestine, the initial part of which is the cecum, to which is attached this little appendix, which probably doesn't serve much purpose in human beings. Uh, it's a remnant of the evolutionary past. Then this cecum giving, continuing as the ascending colon or the ascending large intestine. Ascending was going up, then the transverse colon, which goes across the abdomen to the other side, to the left side, and the descending colon, the large descending part of the large intestine, and then this sigmoid colon, the S-shaped large intestine, finally ending as the rectum and the anal canal and the anus. So this is this tube open at both ends, the mouth here and the anus here. And of course, in the small intestine, we have bile coming from the liver and the pancreatic juice coming from the pancreas. So that is the gastrointestinal tract. This is a little more diagrammatic representation of the same. This long tube, the alimentary canal, as it is called, and the mouth here and the anus here, and this tube and this opening of the tube from the gallbladder and from the pancreas into it, bringing bile and the pancreatic juice. This is further still more diagrammatic. If we consider ourselves to be like a cylinder, through this cylinder is passing this tube, the mouth at one end, the anus at the other. Now, what this picture brings out is that if we put something at this end, it comes out at this end, it serves no purpose. It really enters the body only when it crosses the wall of this tube and gets into the body. In our case, when it gets into the blood, and there is blood supply here, and it is the transfer of the digested food material to that blood that truly takes the food within the body. So the food is not really within the body till it has been transferred, and this transfer to the blood is what we call absorption. And before absorption can take place, the food has to be broken down into small bits, into small absorbable bits, small harmless bits, because the way we consume it, it neither can be absorbed intact, nor is it desirable that all of it should be absorbed intact. It could be quite harmful. So, to make it safe, it's important and absorbable. It's important to break it down into small bits. And that's what digestion is about. And when these constituent units of the complex food that we take get absorbed, some of it remains undigested, some of it is indigestible, and to that may get added some of the germs residing in the large intestine, and all this mixture of undigested food, indigestible food, and bacteria and other microorganisms, all this comes out as the stool. Now, from this, it may appear as if something goes at this end, undergoes complex processing, but all the same processing in this tube, which seems to happen on its own as the food passes from one part to the next, something new happens there. So it's like an assembly line. But the gut is actually much more than an assembly line, and it needs regulation because for food to be digested, we need several juices. They should come at the right time in the right amount and get switched off when they are no longer needed. To be able to move, this, there have to be some movement here, propulsive movement. And that movement should also be synchronized with the necessity for that part. And if the food has to stay a little longer, say in the stomach for 3 to 4 hours, then during that, that movement should stop. So when the movement should stop and start, when the secretion should start and stop, uh, all that has to be regulated. And that regulation takes place through the neuroendocrine machinery of the gastrointestinal tract itself. The gut itself has a very large number of neurons and a neural network, and sometimes therefore sometimes referred to as yet another brain. There's a sort of another brain in the gut, as if. And it has uh, many hormone producing cells. It has an endocrine machinery. So this regulation is by its own neuroendocrine machinery, but it doesn't work in isolation. It is under the influence of the nervous and the endocrine systems of the body as a whole, because the functions of the gut have to be coordinated with the functions of the rest of the body. And the rest of the being connected to the rest of the nervous and endocrine systems also means that there is an influence, a profound influence of the autonomic nervous system on the gut, the part of the nervous system that controls involuntary functions. And secretions and movement of the intestines, gastrointestinal tract are involuntary functions. They're not under the control of willpower. They happen on their own uh, as and when required. So the modulation of function is something that happens quite independent of our conscious knowledge and our conscious will, which is just as good. We don't have to bother about it. Everything seems to go well uh, without our making any conscious effort. But it also means that our thoughts and emotions could influence through the autonomic nervous system the function of the gastrointestinal tract. And that's how our feelings get reflected in how we feel in the tummy. And then there is an interaction with the liver and the pancreas, which also has to be coordinated with the activity of the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. And then on top of that, the gastrointestinal tract is home to a very large number of microorganisms. It's one of the major sites where we host a large number of microorganisms. The skin is the other major organ where we have a large number of these bacteria and other microorganisms. So these microorganisms have a very active, by and large symbiotic and synergistic relationship with the function of the gastrointestinal tract. We help the we host the germs, we help them live there, and the germs help us in many ways in living a healthy life. So it's this interaction with this microbiome, which could get easily altered by alterations in the diet, by taking antibiotics, and by the various polluting influences in the environment. So this interaction with the microbiome uh, is another complication that gets added to the gastrointestinal function. Complication, if we look upon it when things go wrong with it, but otherwise, it's a part of normal gastrointestinal function. So, all these complexities mean that the function is not simple. It can be easily disturbed, and a large variety of sources. The disturbances could come from any aspect of the lifestyle, if we want to call it that way, which means our diet, physical activity, smoking, drinking, sleep, and mental stress. All these could disturb some of these regulatory mechanisms which can influence the function of the gut and get reflected in various types of gastrointestinal problems. And that's why the gut becomes a mirror of the general health. And on the other hand, the gut itself can also influence health in general. So, for example, disturbances of the microbiome may lead to overweight, and that overweight could in turn increase the possibility of diabetes and hypertension and heart disease. So, uh, this could be a contributor to the other lifestyle diseases. So, no wonder digestive problems are among the commonest that take a person to a doctor. And the profound influence of psychological factors on the functions of the gut is brought out that about half the patients who go to gastroenterologists have either anxiety or depression, and it is this underlying mental distress which manifests in the form of physical symptoms in the gut, like acidity or irritable bowel. Let's start with the irritable bowel, s- sometimes called the irritable bowel syndrome. In medical parlance, syndrome means a collection of symptoms, which means that it may not be confined to the bowel. There may be other symptoms outside the bowel, and it's a whole collection which together is called the syndrome. And this irritable bowel syndrome is the commonest disorder in gastroenterology practice. It's the commonest partly because it is quite common, partly because the same patient keeps going again and again because it's unless one goes to the root, it remains essentially incurable. Now let's see what the symptoms of the irritable bowel are. The person finds that there's a change in bowel habits without any apparent cause, and this change has a tendency to persist. Uh, and You might recollect I had talked about a patient who came to me with around 30 years of persistent symptoms in the gastrointestinal tract. It had started with the change in the nature of his duties. The person was in the Navy, and the new duties involved inspection. And this was a stressful job because the stress, he was under stress whether or not to report any fault that had been found. If he doesn't report it, he'll not be doing his duty well. If he reports it, his colleagues could be in trouble. And but he could not see the stress related to the beginning of this change in the bowel habits. Started with diarrhea, and the person felt that it is probably because of the change in the food habits, or rather change in the food available. He was no longer getting homemade food because now he had to travel quite a bit to go on this inspection from one unit to another in different parts of the country. So because of this, he was not getting homemade food, and he attributed it to that. But then a change in food cannot give symptoms going on for 30 years. But during these 30 years, naturally, he had visited many doctors because the symptoms had persisted, and he had received quite a bit of advice about change in diet and different types of medication and investigations. And uh, during the investigations, it was found that he has a transposition of the intestines. That is, what should have been on the left side was on the right side and the other way around ever since birth. Now, this was thought maybe linked to it. So he underwent surgery for the correction of this anomaly. But then he had lived with this type of a transposed intestine for about 30 years without any symptoms. So apparently, this was not the cause, and therefore, the surgery also did not help. But then, because of this prolonged continuation of the symptoms, the intestinal wall had started getting thicker, and that had sort of started showing structural change. But then, what this person needed was to understand that the roots lay in something that happened 30 years ago. That change of duty continued for some time, but then the symptoms outlasted his return to home and getting homemade food, because now he had been retired for quite some time. So he got these symptoms around the age of 40, and now he was about 70. So the change, obviously, uh, which triggered the starting initiation of this disease, no longer applied. But now it had become a habit with him. Habit, partly of the because he was worried about these symptoms while they are not going away. No, worry has a way of prolonging, because irritable bowel essentially starts because of psychological reasons, and psychological reasons can also lead to its continuation. And one of the psychological reasons can be that the person gets worried about the disease which is not going away. So the disease is because of the worry, and disease becomes the cause of the worry, which only perpetuates the disease. It becomes a vicious cycle. So, return to the first symptom, that the person initially notices that there's change in bowel habits without any apparent cause. And therefore, the person may attribute it to a wrong cause, as this person did, that it is because of the change in food. Because we have a tendency to blame physical factors for even diseases which are rooted in psychological causes. So, he was a change in bowel habits without any apparent cause. And the change may be towards constipation or diarrhea. It could go either way. And depending upon which way it goes, irritable bowel is called constipation predominant or diarrhea predominant. And it may not remain always so, even in the same person. A person who has constipation predominant type of irritable bowel could, with time, change to diarrhea predominant, and the other way around. And keep alternating, sometimes becoming constipation predominant and sometimes diarrhea predominant. So both could be there, but still, on the whole, there's a tendency in a given individual to have irritable bowel, which is either constipation predominant or diarrhea predominant. Then there is abdominal pain, which could be of two types, that is, building up and then falling, that is, pain increasing and decreasing, what we call a colicky type of pain. Starting with mild pain, rising to a peak, and then again easing out, falling. Or it could be a continuous constant pain, which we call cramps. Then distension of the abdomen. And along with this, person could also feel that the a ball of wind is moving inside, uh, from one part of the abdomen to the other. So the distension is more sort of in one part at one moment, and one during for some time, and then it's more at another part. Then this feeling of incomplete evacuation. This is a very important and prominent symptom. Uh, the person passes the motion, but especially if the person has constipation, the person may pass the motion, but still does not get up with the feeling of having passed all that needed to be passed. The person has this feeling of an incomplete evacuation, as if the job has only been half done. Quite a bit still remains inside. The person feels that more needs to come out, but it's somehow not coming out. So, this feeling of incomplete evacuation is a very prominent symptom. Then, this is not something which uh, can be called a symptom. You will not find in textbooks. Fat file syndrome. Now, this term fat file syndrome occurs in this book by Dr. Nick Reed, a good friend of mine in Sheffield, uh, now retired for quite some time. Healing the illnesses doctors cannot cure. Now, He has used this term fat file syndrome to describe this type of patients. He's an expert on irritable bowel. Now, what happens is that when the person gets this, he goes to a doctor. Whatever treatment the doctor gives might help for some time, but then the symptoms have a way of returning. The doctor may investigate this person, but by and large, the person has no abnormality in those investigations. Most of the tests are normal. Uh, Now, the doctor tells him there's nothing wrong with you. The tests are all normal. Uh, he has given him some treatment which has not worked. The doctor says all is well with you because there's no finding on examination, there are no findings on investigation, but the patient is still not well. The patient still has symptoms. So he goes to another doctor. So he goes from one doctor to another. If one system of medicine doesn't help him, he tries another system of medicine. Allopathy is not working, he tries Ayurveda. Ayurveda is not working, he tries homeopathy. If homeopathy is not working, he tries naturopathy. So he keeps moving from system to system. And then he goes on filing all the reports and all the prescriptions that he has received. And that's how he builds up a fat file. And finally, he walks into the office of a doctor with this fat file, yet new doctor, and yet another doctor. He walks into his office, into his chamber with a fat file full of these prescriptions and reports. Now, this goes on till he finds a doctor who can go to the root and discover that all these symptoms have been the result of uh, underlying mental distress. And it's only when that happens that there's some hope that finally the person may get well. So the causes of this irritable bowel are mental distress, which is the underlying worry, chronic worry. Worry might have led to this mental distress, and this worry may result from the fact that the disease is not getting well. Lack of physical findings. There is lack of physical findings, and so the investigations, the tests are also essentially normal. And it may be associated with headache or sleeplessness because these can also be a very common accompaniments of the mental distress. And the disease itself may further aggravate that distress, leading to a still greater possibility for getting a headache or sleeplessness. Now, how to manage the irritable bowel? The most important thing is to understand the disease and go to its roots and deal with stress. But then here are some other things which one can talk about: what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, and how to eat. And these are all things which we have talked about in considerable detail in the course yes.02. Uh, the type of diet that is generally advised is a high fiber diet. High fiber, the quantitatively, the best source of fiber in the diet are whole grains, that is, unrefined cereals and pulses. Brown bread instead of white bread, and legumes or dals or pulses, again unrefined, that is, those which have their seed coat intact. And if that doesn't work, one may supplement it with isabgol. Isabgol helps constipation by adding bulk, and also helps diarrhea by binding the stool. How it adds to the bulk is that isabgol soaks water, and after soaking water, it swells up and forms a viscous mass. So that's how it adds to the bulk. Further, it is water soluble fiber, which means that it gets fermented by the bacteria in the gut. And by increasing the bacterial population, again, it adds to the bulk because these bacteria, again, add to the bulk, and quite a bit of these bacteria come out in the stool. And so it adds as a bulking agent. Isabgol acts as a bulking agent. Isabgol also helps diarrhea by binding the stool, soaks up the water in the watery stool, and thereby converts this stool into a relatively well-formed viscous mass instead of remaining watery. So by binding the stool, it again helps diarrhea. It also. So in other words, it can normalize the movements of the gastrointestinal tract. Constipation, usually is associated with reduced motility, reduced movement of the intestines. Diarrhea is due to excessive movement. Isabgol can help both. It can increase the motility in constipation by adding to the bulk and can reduce the motility by binding the stool in diarrhea. So sometimes we describe this utility of isabgol in both constipation and diarrhea by saying that it normalizes the motility of the gut. Then, of course, one should go to the root of the problem and manage the stress. Again, we have talked about it in individual sessions of stress management in many of these courses that we've done in the past. And visualization. Now, visualization is a technique that can be used in uh, several situations, including heart disease. I think it was referred to also while talking about heart disease, visualizing the coronary arteries opening up by the fat in these coronary arteries melting. Now, the general principle of visualization is that if one has some sort of a vague idea, even a vague idea, of what is going on in the body and in which part of the body, what one can do is that one can incorporate in the sessions on visualization or during shavasana, during the yogic practices, an element of visualization. What one does in this visualization is that when the mind has been calmed down by meditation or by shavasana, one then focuses the attention on the part of the body which is diseased and tries to visualize the abnormality in that organ clearing up and now the organ becoming normal again. So, in case of the coronary arteries, we saw that the arteries are blocked by fatty deposits. The person is visualizing warmth within, maybe warmth of love, and that is opening up, melting these fatty deposits, melting the fat in those deposits, and the arteries are opening up. Now, as you can see, that the process, real process in the body cannot be as simple as that. But that doesn't matter. The visualization doesn't have to be absolutely exact from the anatomical point of view or from the point of view of the uh, pathophysiological and biochemical changes taking place in that organ during disease and during healing. It doesn't have to be exact. One can put in one's own imagination, fab, come up with, invent one's own sort of uh, visualization of the disease and the healing process. So the main thing is that the person is visualizing going from the disease state to a healthy state through self healing, visualizing those mechanisms of the body which are getting activated, which will lead to normalization of that structure and function in that part of the body. So, in case of, say, visualization, in the case of the irritable bowel, and the person can visualize, for example, an unruly set of school children in the playground. And then in the playground appears the sports teacher. The sports teacher blows a whistle. Now, that whistle uh, is a sort of signal to the children that now they should organize themselves in proper lines. And then after that starts um, some physical activity, say PT, physical training. And you find that with some music in the background. And you find these children swaying in a very uh, rhythmic way, synchronized, every child's movement synchronized with the music, and you find that is a beautiful display of physical movements, a beautiful PT display. So that disorganized running around gets converted uh, in the presence of this teacher by by presence of the teacher converts it into a very pleasing, organized, rhythmic uh, movement. And the trigger is the whistle. So the person can visualize his intestines also behaving in that way, like these children, and then the divine blows a whistle. And you find that all this disorganized movement quickly organizes itself into a proper, disciplined, rhythmic movement, which is just at the right pace and starts and stops at the right time. Because that is the type of abnormality we have in irritable bowel. Either the movement is too much or it is too little, it is disorganized, and it is at the wrong time. So all that gets corrected as a result of this whistle coming from within, from the divine. Visualize that, and that can become your visualization for irritable bowel. And finally, don't keep thinking about the disease. Get busy. Uh, it's not a serious illness. It's not life threatening. Let go. So let go of the obsession with the disease. Get busy with something else. The less you think about it, the faster one gets better. Now we turn to another very common problem of the gastrointestinal tract: acidity, gastritis, and peptic ulcer. They are a cluster with similar causation, and they can overlap. One can lead to the other. Acidity, one might say, is the mildest type of situation of this type. There is greater production of acid, and that's what makes the person a little uncomfortable. Some of this acid sometimes gets regurgitated, that is, comes out instead of going, the contents going from the stomach to the small intestine. Some of this acid gets from the stomach into the food pipe, travels up, and leads to heartburn. Sometimes it leads to water brash, that is, a bit of this acid gets mixed with the saliva in the mouth and comes from this food pipe to the mouth, and one feels a little acidic taste in the mouth. So, or the person may have some belching, that is passing gas through the mouth, gas coming out from the mouth, uh, bloating of the abdomen getting sort of swollen. So bloating, belching. So some of these things which indicate acidity. But apart from that, there's no other problem. If acidity is severe, continues for long, it may lead to gastritis. That is, there is a real inflammation in the of the stomach. Itis, causes inflammation. Any injury leads to an inflammatory response. The excessive acid has been present for too long and very regularly, and that has finally injured the lining of the stomach, leading to an inflammatory response. So this gastritis, and this may be visible on endoscopy if one has an inside a look at the walls of the stomach from the inside by passing a tube at the end of which there's a small little camera which can uh, take a picture and give us a picture of what the stomach looks like inside. When we get that inside view, we find that the stomach is more red than it should be. And that redness is one of the signs of inflammation. So this person has gastritis. But essentially, it started with acidity. But then, if this gastritis continues for long enough, it could eventually cause damage to a localized part in the stomach to certain places where it starts forming some sort of a pit, a crater, because of that injury, and that is what you call an ulcer. So, ulcer is essentially the development of a pit or a crater in the wall of the stomach or the duodenum. It could be in the stomach or in the small intestine immediately after the stomach, the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. It could be at either of these places, and both are together called the peptic ulcer. So, gastric ulcer if it is in the stomach, and duodenal ulcer if it is in the duodenum. Both are peptic ulcer. So peptic ulcer includes both gastric and duodenal ulcer. So all these cluster, you can see essentially one single entity, uh, the intensity of the disease increasing from acidity to gastritis, from gastritis to a peptic ulcer. And since the apparent culprit, the immediate culprit is the acid in the stomach, it may be because of excessive acid production. But it's better to look at it as an imbalance between acid production and the protective mechanisms. Because forming acid in the stomach is natural. It is as natural for the stomach to produce acid as it is for the heart to beat. This is an essential part of the digestive function. And it's a protective function also. The acid has a protective function. Our food may have harmful germs, and those germs cannot survive this acid. So it is a major defense mechanism for killing the bacteria before the food goes further to the small intestine. And that's why perhaps this acid has been placed at the first point when the food really enters the gastrointestinal tract. Right at the beginning in the stomach, we have this acid. And then to initiate the process of digestion, we also have an enzyme, pepsin, which can act on proteins in an acidic environment. So pepsin is the enzyme that works in an acidic environment. All the subsequent enzymes which will come in the small intestine work in an alkaline environment. By then, the acid has been replaced by the alkali from the pancreatic juice. So coming again, sort of, there may be excessive acid production, but essentially there's an imbalance between the acid production and the protective mechanisms. Now, since we have this acid production, which is normal for the stomach to produce, we also have protective mechanisms to prevent this acid from damaging of the wall of the wall of the stomach itself. Because if this acid can be harmful, it can have corrosive effects. On top of that, we have an enzymes which can digest proteins, pepsin, in the stomach. Now, after all, what is the lining of the stomach? The lining of the stomach also is made up of proteins. Could this enzyme, in the presence of this acid, not start digesting the wall of the stomach itself? And acid also is pretty strong acid. It has a corrosive effect. Could this acid not by itself also damage the uh, walls of the stomach? Why that does not normally happen is that firstly, this acid is produced only when required, not all the time. So when there is no food, there is no acid production and there's no pepsin production. When there is food, acid is produced, pepsin is produced, but then they have a job to do. So they get busy with that job, digesting the food. And when that job is done, the acid production and enzyme production is switched off. So it's a well coordinated mechanism, regulatory mechanism, which makes sure that acid and the enzyme will be there only when really required for the digestion. But there can be something that can go wrong with this mechanism, and there could be excessive acid production. Acid production also when it is not really required, and it could start damaging the wall of the stomach. But then the acid production may be quite normal, but the protective mechanisms may be deficient, they may be defective. There are all types of defense mechanisms, including a thick layer of mucus that lines the stomach. The type of cells that line the stomach are also of a special variety. They do not allow this acid or pepsin to really penetrate the junctions between the cells. The cells are better constructed. Stronger material has been used here. For example, you use stronger material on the roof as compared to the walls because the roof is what is exposed to the elements, the weather, the bad weather, and so on, much more than the walls. So here there's better material used for the cells, which is stronger. And apart from that, there are special chemicals like prostaglandins which protect. So there are plenty of protective mechanisms which protect the wall of the stomach. There could be something defective in these protective mechanisms. So either the acid is too much for the protective mechanisms to be effective, or the protective mechanisms are too weak for even dealing with the normal amount of acid production. So it's essentially this imbalance. And how this imbalance may be produced has been summed up in these three words: hurry, worry, and curry. That is, the person has a certain type of personality or job where he's in a hurry all the time, or the person has a tendency to worry about things, and the person has a diet in which there are plenty of chilies, as in a curry that has plenty of chilies. So, hurry, worry, and curry. That is what can lead to this imbalance, lead to essentially excess of acid production. And some of the underlying causes one can see could be irregular meals, chilies, tea, coffee, smoking, drinking, a stressful job. All these are the apparent, visible, immediate causes for creating this imbalance, which then shows up as acidity, gastritis, and eventually maybe sometimes as peptic ulcer disease. Then there's an imbalance between job requirements and the tendency towards worry and anxiety. This we shall return to in a moment once again. So the job requirements are such that it is likely to lead to worry and anxiety, but again, there's an imbalance because a certain degree of stress some people can handle quite well. But if the stress becomes too much, then the person, even a normal person, can't cope. Or the other way around is also possible. The stress may be quite uh, low, but the person has an inherent tendency towards worry and anxiety, and therefore this becomes too much for this person. So once again, there's an imbalance. And then many of the painkillers, commonly used painkillers, also cause gastritis. And among the safest is paracetamol. But still, to be on the safe side, if one takes a painkiller, one can also take an antacid along with it. And even more important is not to take a painkiller empty stomach. Because if there is food, then whatever acidity this painkiller produces will give that acid job to do. So it will work on the food rather than on the stomach. So painkillers should not be taken on empty stomach. And secondly, they may be taken with an antacid. Now, coming back to job requirements, Arthur Haley has written so many beautiful novels, and they're very well researched novels. Uh, it's amazing, I mean, how he has done research on uh, not only airports, as in this book, the airport, but also on hotels, on pharmaceutical industry, on the medical profession, because he has novels on each of these subjects. And his, there are novels which are based on a great deal of research in these professions. That's quite obvious. Anyway, so coming to this novel Airport, uh, in this occurs a person who is an air traffic controller. Now, the job of an air traffic controller can be very stressful because what this person has is in front of him a screen, say like a computer screen, and on this screen show up the planes in the vicinity of the airport as little dots. And the job of this air traffic controller is to keep giving instructions to the pilots of each of these planes, which he can see as little dots on his screen, to make sure that they do not collide with each other, that these planes do not collide. Because near the traffic is heavy. The planes are very near each other. And some of these planes are taking off, some are landing. So they are not only dots which are moving all the time, but they are also moving either up or down. And therefore, the chances of collision become quite high. But he has to make sure that they do not collide. And therefore, he may tell one pilot to ascend by a few thousand feet, to another to descend by a few thousand feet, so that even if they are uh, in each other's path, because of the distance which separates them in terms of the height, they don't collide. Now, to do that for a large number of aeroplanes simultaneously, which are moving all the time, which are not stationary dots, and make sure that they do not collide, can be a pretty stressful job. And yet he has to convey these instructions in a cool and calculated voice so that his worry does not get transmitted to the pilot. So he's doing it in apparently a very cool and calm, composed voice, but his mind has to be extremely active and alert all the time, and he can be under considerable stress. Because one little mistake and there could be a mid-air collision. Now, there was one such air traffic controller who once did make one such mistake once, and as a result, in a plane, some people had died. Now, this is something which remained in his memory for a very long time and would keep haunting him. And he kept regretting how he made that mistake. So, in the psychic being hurting. And it was this repeated hurt, this repeated uneasiness, this repeated sense of guilt, which he kept feeling for the mistake that he had made and which had led to this death, that gave him peptic ulcer. Another new factor which was discovered only around 1980 was the presence of a germ in the stomach, Helicobacter pylori. And this was a discovery made by a young doctor, Barry Marshall, and a pathologist, Robin Warren. And it was quite interesting because these germs had probably been observed even earlier in many people having peptic ulcer, but the two had not been linked up because the main cause of peptic ulcer was thought to be uh, too many chilies and mental stress. These were the two major things that were associated with hurry, worry, and curry. Hurry and worry, the mental stress, and curry, the chilies. So that is what was thought to be the major cause of peptic ulcer. But then, through um, sort of an intuitive sort of developing an association between these germs and the peptic ulcer, and then working it out in some detail, first is to start with to make sure that the numbers were large enough and there was a strong statistical association. They and then trying to get into the mechanisms how these germs may be causing peptic ulcer. All that led to an establishment of these germs as one of the possible contributors to peptic ulcer disease. And this discovery was, the type that you say belongs to the category where one has to have a prepared mind, a mind which is alert, a mind which will not dismiss something as an accidental or as a chance finding, but will try to get into its roots and try and see whether it can teach us something. So they had this young person, Barry Marshall, had that type of prepared mind, and the two of them sort of in a type of partnership came up with this association and established it. A bit about the history of this discovery. Barry Marshall, to start with, actually wanted to become an engineer. He wanted to be an engineer, not a doctor, but he was not very good at maths. And therefore, he could not get into the career of an engineer and instead settle down for becoming a doctor. So, again, shows, I mean, how it helps to try and do something that you are really good at and avoid something which you may not turn out to be very good at. Because we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and success depends upon making the best use of our strengths, getting into a career which will use our strengths the best, and a career in which our weaknesses will not matter. So that's what he did. He ended up joining medicine because he could not become an engineer because of his weak maths. Then he wanted to study cardiology. But then while he was studying cardiology, they were sent to different departments by rotation, and one of those rotations was to gastroenterology. So again, helps in undergoing a multidisciplinary training because there can be linkages between one specialty and another, and therefore a bit of exposure to other departments helps. Then, he was looking for a research topic. Uh, Barry Marshall was looking for a research topic, and while he was in gastroenterology, he discovered that Robin Warren, who was a gastrointestinal pathologist, had seen some curved bacteria in patients and wanted to have someone, especially a clinician, who could study with him whether these curved bacteria had any significance, especially in peptic ulcer disease. And Barry Marshall had also seen an association between peptic ulcer and these bacteria in his career, and then they worked on it in a methodical way and finally reached the conclusion that there is an association. But initially, when they presented this work, it was received with a great deal of skepticism because this was not in keeping with the with stress and chilies being the major cause. And there were other reasons which we shall see in a moment, because association is not perfect. And there can be these germs present, but no peptic ulcer disease. And there can be peptic ulcer disease without these germs. Then one of the things which helped him initially getting his work accepted was his wife, a psychologist whom he married while he was still a medical student. And she had she has very good writing skills. So she helped him present the work in such a way that's more likely to be accepted. Uh, Now, what is special about this germ Helicobacter pylori? It can live in the midst of acid. Most germs can't. Most germs die. But then this germ produces an enzyme, urease, which it produces an enzyme urease, which helps it live in the midst of acid. Urease creates an alkaline environment for the germ. Then, we have a very well developed immune system in the gut. Over the long period that this germ has lived in the stomach, long period, I mean thousands of years of evolution or millions of years of evolution, uh, what this germ has done is to learn to live in the stomach, in the acid environment, and also to hoodwink the immune system, the local immune system of the gastrointestinal tract. And that's how it's able to stay there. In fact, it uses this immune system to create inflammation in the stomach. And this inflammation could be of the type that leads to sometimes not necessarily excessive acid production. It may lead to reduced acid production. And it also benefits us by protecting us against allergies and autoimmune diseases because of its interaction with the immune system. Now, this gives us many other ramifications. One of the ramifications is that there are other causes for peptic ulcer, and therefore, all cases of peptic ulcer may not have this germ. Secondly, it also tells us that there may be not only patients who have the germ, but this germ may be associated not with excessive acid, but with reduced acid. So that's how we can have patients who have less of acid, reduced acidity, or normal acidity, but peptic ulcer disease, and people who may have excess acid, but no peptic ulcer disease. Reduced acid, but peptic ulcer disease may be because of this germ, or it may be because the protective mechanisms in general are weak. In the same way, excess acid uh, may not be associated with peptic ulcer if the protective mechanisms are good. So you can have all these combinations. Another important ramification of this is that the presence of this germ, the germ has an intimate interaction with the immune system of the body. And some of these interactions are useful, like reducing the risk for allergies and autoimmune diseases. But some of these can turn out to be harmful. But then, can the immune system be improved upon so that, in spite of the germ, whatever interaction is there may give us this protection, but not the harmful effects like peptic ulcer? That again should be possible if our immune system is good. And improving the function of the immune system, again, depends a lot on psychological factors. So, psychological factors could impair the immune system and thereby also increase the probability of this germ, apart from other factors. This could be one of the contributory factors that impaired immune function because of mental stress could increase the possibility of this germ, if it happens to be present in the stomach, giving rise to peptic ulcer disease. Which means that the immune system being strong helps not only in preventing infections, it also helps in preventing many other lifestyle diseases which are now associated with subclinical chronic inflammation. But improving the immune system function of the immune system through uh, mental peace could also help in reducing the possibility of peptic ulcer, not only directly by uh, giving us a better regulation of the secretion of the acid, but also by reducing the possibility of this germ leading to peptic ulcer. So you can see all these things can be linked up one with the other, and eventually it boils down to taking care of all lifestyle factors, particularly mental stress. So the ulcer could be in the stomach or in the duodenum. If it's in the stomach, we call it gastric ulcer. If it is in the duodenum, we call it duodenal ulcer. Now, what are the symptoms? The symptoms are that there may be no symptoms. The person may have an ulcer and yet have no symptoms, but quite often there are symptoms: belching, that is, bringing out gas from the mouth, bloating, the abdomen swelling up, pain. Now, this pain in duodenal ulcer is usually early in the morning and is relieved by eating. Throughout the night, acid has been produced, which is started hurting the ulcer, but then food makes use of this acid so that instead of getting into the duodenum and hurting the ulcer, now gets busy digesting the food in the stomach. So that's also relieved by eating. But in gastric ulcer, there's a tendency towards producing too much acid, and the response of eating itself is to produce still more acid, and therefore the pain may get worse in gastric ulcer. Things are not as clear cut always, but this sort of is the classical distinction. And then in gastric ulcer, there's a greater possibility of water brash, that is acid traveling up towards the food pipe, getting mixed with the saliva in the mouth, and giving this taste of a little rush of watery, acidic water in the mouth. If peptic ulcer disease advances further, it can lead to complications, and these are two dreaded complications: bleeding, which may show up as blood in the vomitus or as blood in the stool. If it appears as blood in the stool, by the time it has passed through the entire gastrointestinal tract, it becomes brown. So in the stool, it may show up as brownish discoloration, and sometimes it is what we may call occult blood, that is blood which is not very easy to see, but sometimes it may also show up as blood in the vomitus, hematemesis. The It also lead to eventually perforation, that is the pit or the crater of the ulcer keeps getting deeper till it burrows through the wall of the stomach and leads to a hole, that is perforation, and then the contents of the stomach and intestine uh, get into the abdomen, which is a serious complication, acute emergency. It's an emergency. Now, what's the treatment of peptic ulcer? Small, frequent meals so that the acid has most of the time some job to do rather than work on the stomach. And for the same reason, the person should not fast. Uh, the diet should not have any chilies, tea or coffee, and no alcohol, because all these things increase the acid production. Smoking also increases acid production, so no smoking. And painkillers, again, one should avoid them unless absolutely essential. A high fiber diet. Now, this is something where it's just the opposite of what I learned as a medical student. Those days, we used to say low fiber diet. A high fiber diet was thought to irritate the stomach, which already has an ulcer. But now we know that, in fact, a high fiber diet can help because it makes the food, converts the food into a soft, viscous mass, which is much better than to have food as such. So, fiber actually helps in making the food gentler to the stomach and also helps in buffering the action of the acid. Then, medication for acidity. Uh, we have the first generation antacids, uh, which were purely sort of to neutralize the acid. Brand names like, Gelusil and Digene and belong to that category. And then we had the second generation, which acted on the receptors in the stomach uh, where the secretion takes place, back to the secretory mechanisms, the H2 receptor antagonists like ranitidine. Then we had the third generation, which directly reduced the acid production, like omeprazole. Now, it has become quite a routine to now prescribe the third generation because extremely effective and fairly safe. Then medication for Helicobacter pylori. The If the germ is present, naturally the assumption would be probably is contributing to the disease. So one can give the appropriate antibiotics and go change in the attitude to events and circumstances of life to reduce stress. Visualization. Now, as in case of irritable bowel and peptic ulcer, also one can have visualization. And one useful visualization could be to visualize the angry red stomach with acid rushing in torrents into the stomach. So, a lot of acid being produced as if there's a tap there through which we have a big rush of acid being poured into the stomach, which is angry and red. And then one gradually visualizes uh, the acid reducing, the tap becoming sending less and less of acid, and the surface of the stomach changing from that angry red to a beautiful pink, like the petals of a pink rose. And then on that, just a few drops of this acid appearing not as something corrosive, but as appearing dewdrops. So just contrast these two pictures, that of an angry red stomach being made further angry by this rush of acid and changing gradually into a pink, beautiful, pleasant, pleasing pink on which there are just a few drops of dew. Now, this type of a change happening as a result of our body's own mechanisms during meditation, if one visualize it and sees this healing happening from change from one to the other, being within the reach of the body, being a part of the self-healing mechanisms, which are being activated by the divine on which one is concentrating during the meditation. So visualize the divine influence, which is making these self-healing mechanisms be at their best and leading to this type of a dramatic change within those few minutes of visualization from an angry red to a pleasing pink, from a rush of acid to just a few dewdrops. How about the yogic practices? Firstly, what one should avoid doing. Avoid Paschimuttanasana, Shashankasana, Kapalabhati. A yogic practice which could help, but this is one of those cleansing techniques which should be done only under supervision. Uh, Vaman Dhoti or Kunjal. What this consists of is preparing 2 liters of uh, salty water, 2 liters of warm water to which can be added 2 teaspoons of salt. And then drink as much of it as possible, uh, 6 to 8 glasses of it. The result will be one will feel extremely full. When one feels extremely full, then one may feel like vomiting it out. And if one does not feel like, one should stimulate vomiting so that it comes out. And the way one can stimulate is by taking 3 fingers inside the mouth, and the index finger, the middle finger, and the ring finger, the 3 middle fingers. That is, leaving the thumb and the little finger out, the 3 fingers in the middle, uh, including the middle finger and the 2 fingers on either side of the middle finger. Put these 3 fingers in the mouth, take them a little to the root of the tongue to the backside, and a little stimulus there usually stimulates vomiting. So that is Vamanadhoti or Kunjal. But then this is something which should be learned properly through uh, guidance from a person and done under supervision. Now we come to the last of the issues that we'll be talking about today, and that is constipation. Now, firstly, one has to be sure that one is truly constipated because not passing a stool for a day, sometime or the other, does not necessarily mean that the person is constipated. Some people may, in fact, by habit, pass stool only once in 2 days. What is important for a person to be labeled having constipation is the consistency of the stool. The stool also has to be hard. Not only the frequency has to be low, but it has to be hard stool. And of course, constipation can be obstinate. But then, if one worries about it, it will make it more obstinate. Constipation can be worse in winters. Uh, Through common sense, one would feel that's quite possible because of a variety of reasons. Firstly, although the temperature inside is regulated, but still the lowermost part of the gut is sufficiently in contact with outside air for that to influence the stool, and therefore the stool could become harder, sort of freeze inside, and that's what could make it harder. Then, we tend to drink very little water in winters, perhaps even less than we should, and therefore less water is left behind, and that also can worsen the constipation. So it can be worse in winters. And from the Ayurvedic point of view, the Ayurvedic explanation would be that in winters, there's a predominance of vata, and vata is both uh, vata is dry and cold, and that is what can make this worse. Now, chronic constipation has serious sequelae. That's why constipation is important. It's not just an inconvenience. A straining at the stool can increase the abdominal pressure, which in turn can reduce the return of the blood from the lower intestine, that is the rectum and the anal canal, and it can also block the flow of blood from the legs upwards, and therefore it can lead to uh, not only piles but sometimes also to varicose veins. So chronic constipation has serious sequelae, and therefore, if one is truly constipated, then it's better to take care of it. And some of the things which could help are a high fiber diet, whole grains, unrefined pulses, and fruits and vegetables. And one should take water, especially in winters, only warm water, warm herbal tea. Especially in winters, ghee and oil can be used more liberally in the diet. And some of the fruits that help are ripe banana, papaya, chiku, grapes. Then raisins. Raisins, uh, any type of raisins, particularly manaka, as it's called. And then isabgol. Isabgol can help, but it also increases flatulence and bloating. So that can happen. Therefore, too frequent and regular use of isabgol is also not necessarily very pleasant. However, isabgol can be used if a person is not very habitually constipated. So if a person does not pass stool on one day, that day he can take isabgol to make sure that the next day there will be a stool and it will be not too hard. So isabgol will help in making the stool soft also. Not only it will move the intestine, but by soaking water it, and forming that viscous mass, it will help in making the stool soft the next day. So it will be easier to pass that stool. But for that to happen, it's also important that when that isabgol is taken, it's taken with at least one, preferably 2 glasses of water. The water should accompany the isabgol for isabgol to form that viscous mass, which will add to the bulk and also make the stool soft. Then triphala. Triphala is also something which can be used for preventing and treating constipation. It can prevent as well as treat. It does not have the type of bloating and other things bloating and flatulence as it is associated with isabgol. Triphala does not have that. There are other drugs also uh, available in Ayurveda, but preferable is to take those under medical guidance. Then constipation. Physical activity. Lack of physical activity can contribute in a significant way to constipation. So one should be physically active. Hmm. Yogic postures, in general, all yogic postures would help, particularly those which involve abdominal movements. But all yogic postures should be done regularly uh, in constipation, which means that apart from other reasons for which yogic practices are helpful, in constipation, they would help in reducing constipation also. Then one of the important don'ts is do not strain at the stool. So how should one then deal with constipation? If one does not pass stool, one knows that one will have difficulty in passing stool, then how should one deal with it? Uh, Before sitting down on the seat, uh, oil the passage, which means apply uh, oil with the index finger. For a right-handed person, it's bit easier to apply it with the left finger. Have the oil in the right palm. Use the uh, oil the finger, the left index finger with the from that oil, and then don't try to insert it quickly. Just have a little round motion uh, around the anus. So after that rounded circular motion around the anus, one will find that that area gets softer and the uh, it becomes easier to take the finger inside towards the anal canal. So take it a little bit and then a little more oil, a little more rubbing around the anus in a circular movement. A little more you'll be able to take in, and it doesn't go straight up. There's a curve inside, and therefore it'll they take the finger, let the finger follow the curve, which means it'll have a tendency to go backwards, not straight up, but a little towards the backside. So follow that, and when one does that, eventually you may be able to reach a point where there is some hard stool which you can feel. Now, this hard stool has formed a mass, and if it is made up of a large number of small masses, that is, ball like things, they have all sort of formed a cluster in which one unit is fitting the other, or if it is just one big mass, it has uh, taken up the shape of the intestine itself, fitting snugly there, which means they have sort of planted themselves, the piece of stool or that pieces of stool have planted themselves inside the rectum and anal canal in such a way that now it's difficult to disturb that arrangement. Now disturb that arrangement with the fingers. Try to break this arrangement. You know, the way, I mean, if there's a wall, if you take one brick out of the wall from somewhere, you make it easier for the wall itself to collapse. So the whole wall becomes weak if you are able to take one brick away. So what you can try to do is to manipulate it so that this unity or this that all this stool has achieved and the fit that it has acquired with the intestine, the rectum and the anal canal inside, that fit is broken in some way. And in that process, sometimes when it's small, ball-like things, you may be able to take out a bit of it out with your finger itself. So once that arrangement, the comfortable arrangement which the stool has made for itself inside, that has been disturbed, then you'll find that it will be much easier to pass the rest of it when you sit down on the stool, as on the seat. Now, before sitting on the seat, after this, what one can do is also practice Nauli. So Nauli is a yogic technique, and again, it's better to learn it from a person face to face. Essentially, you are moving the abdominal muscles in such a way that now you are shaking the uh, stool inside a bit. So you shake it up and then sit on the seat. Sit, but don't worry, be relaxed. You'll be able to pass. Do not strain. Do not strain, at least not much, and not regularly. And sitting on the seat, if it doesn't work for some time, relax, get up. If it will not come today, it will come tomorrow. Sooner or later, it has to come. So relax. relax, get up, take a spoon of isabgol that day with 2 glasses of water. And the next morning, probably you will get the stool. You can repeat these things before sitting down on the seat the next day. One thing you might have seen which was missing in this treatment was laxatives. Laxatives should, in fact, be avoided. And this can be best understood through this picture why laxatives should be avoided. Now, this first picture shows the normal evacuation. That is, to start with, this whole thing was full. As a result of evacuation, this much of the large intestine has been emptied out. The person could not pass the stool. The person thinks he's constipated, so he takes a laxative. What the laxative does is to empty out much more of the large intestine than is emptied in a normal stool. So this much has been emptied out. But the next day, this whole office will not fill up. By the next day, only part of it would fill up. This is still empty. And if this is empty, the person will not have the urge to pass the stool. The person will not be able to pass the stool. And what happens is the person gets confirmed that I truly have constipation, because even in 2 days, this whole thing may not fill up. So this is evacuation after taking the laxative. This is 1 day after the laxative, and this is 2 days after the laxative. Even after 2 days, this much is empty. So if on the second day also the person does not pass the stool, does not have the urge to pass the stool, which is quite natural because all this is empty, the person gets confirmed in his mind, I truly have a very bad constipation. It's only laxatives which can make me pass the stool. The person takes a laxative and again this much empties out. And the next 2 days, again, it doesn't fill up. See, that day I took the laxative, I could pass the stool. Now for 2 days, I haven't had a stool because I have not taken laxative. So the person thinks that it's only laxatives can make me pass a stool. Otherwise, I'm truly constipated. But actually, the person is not giving enough time for it to fill up. And if the person allows this time to fill up, chances will improve. But what will also happen is that the stool will become hard because this stool has had a long time up, it's increasing. By the third day or the fourth day, it will have spent a lot of time in the large intestine. And therefore, this large intestine had an opportunity to keep absorbing water from it. And therefore, this has become hard. So not only it will take a long time for it to fill up, it will get filled up with harder stool. So these two things, firstly, that the laxative itself perpetuates the constipation by emptying much more than is necessary. Secondly, eventually, when you stop the laxative for 3 or 4 days, the intestine does get filled up, but then it gets filled up with hard stool because of more water getting absorbed. And the result is that the person still gets a very filled up, this person's large intestine is filled up with hard stool. And therefore, laxatives should be avoided. Well, I mean, we have been talking about taking good care of all parts of the body. In case of particularly guts, it seems that the guts that behave the best are the ones that are the least cared for. Least cared for, not in the sense of not eating right or so on, but least cared for in the sense that one is not obsessed with the gut, one is not worrying about the gut, one is not getting unduly disturbed if one does not pass the stool for a day, one is not getting unduly disturbed in irritable bowel. If one uh, just trusts the wisdom of the body to correct the irritable bowel or the constipation and not worry about it, these disorders have a way of disappearing. And in that sense, the best guts are the ones that are least cared for, just as the best governed is the least governed. You'll find all these three disorders discussed in this chapter 14 of Back to Health Through Yoga. This is the meditation hall and the shrine of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. Only yesterday we celebrated the foundation day of the ashram. Uh, and we had a very large number of guests, which we were happy to see on that day. You're always welcome here. If you have any comments or questions, please drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. The anatomical picture with which we started, which had the entire gastrointestinal tract, was taken from Tortora and Grabowski's Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible, and thank you all for attending.
Maybe we can close the session with a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone.